Hello, YouTube, social media world. It's me again, Gordon Gossi, coming to you from my living room, dining room in Little Brighton, Ontario. Before I get going, you can see the topic, what I'm going to be talking about. Um, I do these from time to time, just one man's thoughts, opinions, views, and if you like it, I do these periodically when an issue is front and center. And if you like it, you're welcome to like it, or you're welcome to subscribe. I don't know when I'll do the next one. Depends when an issue comes up, which I find sufficiently interesting. And of course, anyone who wants to share it, feel free. If I didn't want to share my opinions, I wouldn't express them on YouTube. But I want to talk about the current conflict going on, the war going on between Russia and Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, um, which can be hard for someone from a North American background. I'm in Canada. It can be difficult to wrap your head around because if you live in this on this continent, live in Canada, the United States, or even Mexico, um, the three main countries on this continent, we haven't had a major conflict here since the U.S. Civil War. Which ended some 160 odd, roughly 160 years ago. So if you're Canadian American, uh, understanding the conflicts that exist over in Europe can be a little challenging. Our history, Canada and U.S., our history doesn't go that far back. But when you look at Europe, especially Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Baltic regions, what I'll call Eastern Europe, generally speaking. There are conflicts that go back centuries. All of Europe, conflicts have gone on for over 1,000 years. For all of recorded human history, there have been conflicts, and those conflicts have centered around territory, around ethnic differences, linguistic differences, religious differences. There's always an excuse to go to war. And in looking at, the geopolitical history, sometimes referred to as realpolitik within Ukraine itself, Ukraine occupies something of a strategic piece of real estate. It's bordered to the south by the Black Sea, which obviously is important for trade, especially if you go back into antiquity. Uh, borders on Poland on the west. You have Russia or the Soviet Union, depending upon what point in history we're talking about, to the north. Across the Black Sea, you have Turkey. These are all major world players throughout human history. Maybe not so much now, but they have been. And so having strategically, it's important in terms of where it's located geographically. On top of that, it's a fertile region. I think they're currently eighth or ninth in terms of the world's grain producers. It's been called the it was considered the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union, and is a major world supplier of wheat. So, looking back historically, at various times throughout history, they've been ruled by the Polish, by a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, by the Austrian Empire, by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The Ottomans for a time, had control over parts of Ukraine, and of course Tsarist Russia before the Soviet era, before the Bolshevik Revolution brought in, Lenin and then Stalin, and then of course, under Soviet rule, it was one of the Soviet socialist republics. So you have this long history during which Ukraine very seldom and only for very short periods of time was ever an independent entity unto itself. Finally, in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed in on itself, then they finally, and for the longest period of history, from 1991 right up to the present day, became an autonomous political entity, Ukraine. As I say, the longest period of an independent Ukrainian state in history. And now we fast forward to the present day, and what's happened is Russia has now invaded the Ukraine. As I understand it, just doing a little bit of research, 30% of the population of Ukraine speak as a first language Russian, which is a significant minority within the country. And looking at it from a Canadian perspective, in this country, we have a sizable linguistic minority in this country. We have Quebec, which has as their official language, that one province, is French. And we've had in Canadian history, we have had conflicts over people from Quebec who have wanted to be an independent, autonomous country as well. The only difference I would submit here is that Quebec, obviously, the largest French-speaking country in the world is France. It's an ocean away. Whereas with Ukraine and its 30% Russian-speaking linguistic minority, Russia is not an ocean away. It's just across a land border. It's right next door. And I do know that 2 regions or districts, I don't know exactly how they determine it, if it's called a state, a province, a region, a district, whatever the case may be, 2 areas within Ukraine held referendums within the last number of years, I believe 4 or 5 years, and 2 regions that are predominantly Russian have declared their independence from Ukraine. However, Ukraine did not recognize either of those referendums. And there have been accusations of reprisals against those regions for trying to break away from Ukraine. No country likes to lose territory. Referencing the American Civil War, we saw what happened when the South tried to declare its autonomy from the northern states. It led to a war. So now we get into a battle for public opinion. And the predominant narrative being put forward now, in the West, certainly, is that Russia bad, Ukraine good, and in our polarized world, that works because people want just a simplistic good, bad, right, wrong narrative. I mean, it permeates every aspect of our world now. There's a right way to think and a wrong way to think, and typically it's government and media that will tell you which is the proper way to view things and which is the improper way to view things. I'll give the most blatant, most obvious example would be our politics. And the way things are entrenched is that if you're on what's generally defined as the left-hand side of the political spectrum, then a polarizing figure like Donald Trump is completely evil, and a Barack Obama is completely good. And for those on the right side of the spectrum, that's reversed. Obama is evil and bad, and Trump is the saint. Reality is, in my world, lies between the 2 extremes, but we live in an era of extremes. So, in terms of the current conflict, Russia is all bad, Ukraine is all good. Uh, I'm not a fan of either Putin. Putin. I always want to say Poutine. It's a kid, call it a kid. It's a Canadian affectation because of French fries, cheese, and gravy. Putin. I'm no big fan of Putin. Likewise, I'm a little more undecided on Zelensky. I don't know enough about him. But one of the narratives that has come out is over the label of Nazi, the being the invading army. It's Russia that has invaded Ukraine, and so the Nazi label has been affixed by some to the Russians. But Putin is in turn, he's throwing the Nazi label on the Ukrainians. And this is where things get contentious and things get difficult because is it possible that there are there individuals within Ukraine who harbor what I'll refer to as Nazi-like sympathies? When you see a flag, like there's a flag that's being flown at some of the rallies, and it's the flag of an organization called the UPA, which is an English translation of the Ukrainian alphabet, which I believe is Coptic, but it's Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And I think one could view them somewhat as being like the Irish Republican Army. And again, for some, the IRA were freedom fighters, and for others, they were terrorists. And likewise with this UPA, for some, they are nationalistic fighters, freedom fighters for Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian independence, and others view them as being racist. And there's an element of truth to both sides. This flag, this UPA flag, is a black rectangle over top, or sorry, rather, it's on top, it's a red triangle. Underneath, it's a black triangle. It is said that the red represents the blood of Ukrainian soldiers, warriors, and the black is the fertile Ukrainian soil. And, they have slogans, glory to Ukraine. I have another I looked up recently. I can't find it now, but there are two slogans. And some view this flag, this UPA flag, as being very much likened to the Confederate flag that you'll see on occasion if you go to a Leonard Skinner concert. They'll have the Confederate flag. And it's as controversial a flag as is that Confederate flag. Maybe not quite as much. I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to say because I'd never even heard of it until it came into the news recently, because Canada's own Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was at a rally in Toronto, and she was actually holding up a scarf emblematic of this flag. Again, a red on top of black. And it had the words on it, the words were written on the flag, this glory to Ukraine slogan. Now, this UPA has something of a problematic history, because when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, when Hitler broke his non-aggression pact with Stalin, before being ground to a halt by the Soviet army, the Nazis were able to occupy and control the Ukraine. And factions within the UPA actually collaborated with the Nazis. They also were engaged in what was referred to as ethnic cleansing. eradicating, murdering over 100,000 Polish people of Polish background. So I talk about these conflicts within Europe over language, ethnicity, religion, go back centuries. They go back 1,000 years or more. And it's hard to understand from a North American perspective how someone can hate someone so severely. I was reading many, many years ago about two parents or two fathers who are from Ireland, one Protestant, one Catholic, and their sons were playing it together in the same hockey league, and they were interviewed by a reporter, and both were saying how were they back in Northern Ireland, how they wouldn't even walk down the same side of the street. The hatred was so ingrained, and they loved being in North America where you forget about that stuff. And that's why a lot of people emigrate to Canada and countries like the United States historically have come over here to get away from all that conflict that has been going on since time immemorial in Europe. They came over here. Territorial questions were less of a concern because we had so much space. And so these hatreds that have been carried from generation to generation to generation just don't happen over here. But I do know, look at the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which ended up into what we typically refer to as the war in Bosnia. Yugoslavia was a satellite of the Soviet Union. It was ruled by a guy named Tito until he died, and it was rife with all these factions based on all those all those issues that I mentioned. Religion, territorial disputes, ethnic disputes, and Tito had been able to basically keep a lid on it. But once he died, it all exploded, and the country that was Yugoslavia became 5 or 6 different countries: Bosnia Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro. I can't even name Serbia. And within Ukraine itself, you have a polarity of ethnic groups. You have people who are ethnic Pole, you have people who are ethnic Russian, people who are ethnic Ukrainian, and then even there's a subgroup of Tartars who trace their ancestry back even further, back into almost prehistoric times. And so you have this, animosity that's been going on forever. And, then you get into the whole geopolitical issue of Russia and Ukraine. For long stretches of Ukraine's history, they have been part of either Tsarist Russia or the old Soviet Union. And then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed in on itself. And Russia is still a world power. They have one of the larger militaries on the face of the planet. I think they're in the top 5, 4th or 5th in terms of the size of their military. Although, that may be up for some debate, but they're a significant military power. And having military power counts because it allows you to influence different parts of the world. The world is so interconnected, it always has been. I mean, look at what happened in the United States. Look at what happened in the United States when the people of Chile, a mineral and resource rich part of South America, they elected a gentleman by the name of Allende. And the Americans didn't believe that he was friendly to U.S. interests. And so they engaged in an overthrow of his government. And as a result, it led to the installation of a brutal military dictator by the name of Pinochet. The U.S. looks to exert its political influence around the world, and one of the ways it does that is through placing military bases. They did it. Look at Iran, for example. They elected a president by the name of Mossadegh. Mossadegh wanted to nationalize that country's oil interests, and so they engaged in a overthrow of his government and installed the Shah of Iran, another brutal dictator. So this game of realpolitik, where major world powers go in and try and influence other countries, is nothing new. It's gone on since time immemorial. And what you have is Russia, former, still a world power, but they've seen since the implosion of the Soviet Union, and they tried to bring in the Commonwealth of CIS, Commonwealth of States. Trent saying the U.S. has been doing that for 150 years, longer. You can go back to the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine. It's gone on forever. And so Russia was looking at their former, what I'll call their sphere of influence. They had their satellite countries. They had the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were within their sphere, as was Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania. And this was the so-called Soviet bloc. And now what we've seen over the ensuing 20, 30 years is slowly, one by one, these countries, the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they've all joined the NATO alliance, as has Romania, as has Poland. So the U.S., I would argue that the U.S. uses NATO to further its interests around the globe. And the more they expand, the greater their prestige, their power, their influence in every part of the globe. So the Russians have been seeing their power and influence diminish. And Ukraine has been making open overtures about wanting to join NATO as well. Notwithstanding two regions within Ukraine voting to secede from Ukraine and to set themselves up as autonomous enclaves of Russian ethnic backgrounds, and they would be aligning themselves, at least nominally, with Russia. And so this open campaigning to join NATO, I view it as somewhat poking the bear. Poke the bear. And what I find interesting is it's come out recently within the last day or two that there has been something of a framework for a peace agreement, peace talks going on between Ukraine and Russia, and they've put together a 15-point tentative framework for a possible peace agreement. And one of the elements of that peace agreement would be that Ukraine would renounce its desire to join NATO. However, at the same time, Zelensky gave an address to Canada's parliament and to the US government. I think Canada was Tuesday and the United States was on Wednesday, in which he made open requests for military support from NATO countries, Canada and the US. So on the one hand, and it makes me question to what degree, how legitimate is this proclamation? Because Zelensky has walked back his desire to join NATO, but I wonder how genuine that is. Is that just a bargaining chip that he's willing to put out there now? But then there's another aspect to this entire conflict, and leaving aside who's good and who's bad, and it's the title of my little video here, is what I call this. I called it war, famine, and disease. These are three things that go together like butter and salt on popcorn. When there is war, when you have significant conflict like we're seeing in Ukraine, again, with Ukraine being a major supplier of wheat to the world, they produce far more than they need. Trent saying, I have no clue. This whole thing is a game to the rich. And, war, unfortunately, for the powers that be, it is something of a game. My view, having studied, I don't claim to be an historian or an expert, but I have read up and I have studied history. And I remember ages ago reading how during World War I, how both Britain and Germany and their proxies were all building up toward war before the hostilities broke out. I think it was 1914. Before the hostilities broke out, there was this huge arms race, if you will. They were both militarizing because they knew it was coming. And then all that was needed was a pretext or an excuse to actually start the hostilities. And that pretext was the murder of an archduke, I believe it was in Sarajevo, Archduke Ferdinand. And it was like, okay, that's our excuse. Why that was the excuse to start World War I have no idea. I don't think it mattered. They just needed some pretext to do that which was already planned. Is that what we're seeing here between Russia and the Ukraine? Are there players behind the scenes dictating, orchestrating? I don't think that's outside of the realm of possibility at all, especially when you consider what I was talking about: war, famine, disease. And obviously, during a military conflict with the Russians bombing from the air the Ukraine, it makes it very difficult to plant and harvest a wheat crop and other crops. So you have the potential for a significant producer of the world's grain to have their production severely limited or maybe completely eliminated. And that's a scary prospect because we have almost 8 billion people living on this planet, 7.9. And there isn't, we already have starvation in this world. Now you cut off one of the world's major suppliers of a staple food like flour. Not a good thing. The other thing is war, as well as bringing famine. Also, quite often, disease comes in, and that's simply because a major cause of disease is unsanitary conditions, and war is not something that is sanitary. Sanitation facilities, sewage treatment, these are things that need to be built and maintained. And it's hard to maintain anything when there are bombs being dropped. And if a sanitation facility is hit, you have the potential for outbreaks of things like cholera and goodness knows what else. And in our interconnected world with refugees flooding borders, that disease can easily be exported. So things are scary. It's not a simplistic good, bad, right, wrong. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? I sometimes feel like I'm watching anyone who used to watch wrestling. Even before Vince McMahon and his WWE or whatever it's called, wrestling was always, it was theater. And the theater would always involve a face, the hero, and the heel, faces and heels. And guys would flip. A wrestler everyone knows is Hulk Hogan. For a time he was a heel, then he became a face, then he became a heel again, then he became a face. Good, bad, good, bad. Who's the good guy, who's the bad guy in this Russian-Ukrainian conflict? The result is bad because regardless of who's the aggressor and who's the defender and who's, for the average citizen of Ukraine, doesn't matter. Life is going to be very, very bad. And it's not, for Russians as well. I mean, Russians are now being hated all around the world. I had an appointment with someone ethnic Russian, But she grew up in the Ukraine. She grew up in Crimea, and she made the point that, she's telling her kids now to tell people that you're Polish or something else. Don't say Russian, because she was almost in tears how so many people are hating on her and her children because they're Russian. And having grown up in the Crimea, she said, regardless of who was in charge, it's like they're fighting over fighting over who gets to be the corruption, who gets to be in charge of all the graft and corruption that exists, whether it's a Russian in charge of it or a Ukrainian in charge with it, the average ordinary citizen. She described a situation where she said when she was going to school in Crimea that quite often the electricity didn't work for large chunks of the day. You usually 3-4 hours into the school day before the electricity would come on, that the classrooms she was in were never heated, that if it was 3 degrees Celsius or higher, that school continued. If it dropped below 3 degrees Celsius, then school would be canceled. Trent just looked it up. Canada provides 15 to 20% of the world's wheat and barley. We're all integrated. I mean, what I envision happening, Ukraine is a top 10 supplier, top 10 producer of grain in the world, of wheat. And we've seen what's happened to oil and gas prices, because both Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of oil. So it's sent prices, that were already climbing, sent them even higher. What's going to happen when world supplies of wheat become constrained is supply and demand. You constrain the supply, demand is pretty much fixed. The price is going to escalate. What will happen is first world nations, the developed world, will gobble up the available supply, and you'll be looking at the developing nations where poverty is rampant, and there's not going to be enough to go around. So it's a difficult situation. The world right now is very much in flux. I happen to believe that this is orchestrated in terms of the World Economic Forum and their so-called Great Reset, and this transitioning from our current system towards something that they're branding. The term they're using for it is stakeholder capitalism. And I think that's just a case of branding. I don't think it has anything to do with capitalism. I think there is very much a move forward towards biodigital convergence. Government of Canada has a department which is called Horizons Canada, which is mapping out this idea of biodigital convergence, which is a merging of the biological. We're biological. A merging of the biological world and the digital world. Another term being bandied about is transhumanism, where we completely change what it means to be human, where we become more like machines. And it's my view that ultimately the end game of this World Economic Forum Great Reset agenda is to have the vast majority of the human population as little more than digital property of government and corporate interests. Your data, your DNA will be your data, is something we're hearing. Now, is this conflict between Russia and Ukraine part of that? Is this just, part of the agenda? Is this a component that's being used to move us into this world? I think that's entirely possible. I think it's entirely possible that what we're viewing is theater, unfortunately, that has tragic human consequences. So it's not a hopeful message. Trent saying, I'm not bending the knee. I espouse a Christian worldview. I am a Christian. And that's not a popular view now because detractors, those who do not hold a Christian worldview, will say of me that I believe in an invisible man in the sky, and I will be ridiculed for my Christian faith. And the opposing worldview is an atheistic worldview. It's one that holds that life itself is all just a random cosmic accident. I'll do another video on that about the different, the competing views. What I'll call I consider mine to be likely the minority view in a country like Canada. It's a minority view that there is a God and that we are a creation. I think the majority view in the world right now is that, certainly in Canada, I think the majority view is that life is just a cosmic accident, that there was a big bang, that matter was just floating around for however many hundreds of millions or billions of years, and then by some cosmic accident, some life forms somehow magically appeared, and then random mutations caused evolution, and basically, humanity, the human brain, which is, in my view, the most complex part of any organism, that it's just simply a matter of chance, luck, of random mutations. In other words, we're the absence of one random mutation away from being non-existent humanity, which is not a view I ascribe to. Trent is commenting and saying, I believe in science and religion, as do I. Science, to my worldview, science is the means, is the process by which human beings try to understand God's creation. And it's a worthwhile endeavor. The difficulty we get into is when humanity decides to play God and starts manipulating the fabric of human life. And then I have an issue. Anyway, Trent, I'll thank you for being the one guy listening. And, do I think Putin is a good guy? No, I don't. But do I think Zelensky is a good guy? No, I don't. I genuinely don't. I think poking the bear with making open overtures to join NATO, that it was, as I say, it was poking the bear, and it was naive. It would be naive not to expect a response. And then again, is this all part of some theatrical show? I leave that as an open question. I won't argue against it. I can't definitively prove it one way or another. All right. Well, thank you, Trent. And I'll say goodnight, and maybe I'll do another one of these in a couple days, defending my Christian faith. Wish me luck. All right. Night.